That was really lyrical, and as a rapper, I give you so much respect for that, and that's just great. Next up, we have Chernoh from Afrika.
Storytelling is one of the greatest attributes of Africans and Africa in general. So I guess I might as well just start with one. You know, I work at the admissions office, and one of the things I do there is giving tours to students, parents, and basically anyone. So one day I was giving a tour to a mom and her daughter, and midway through the tour, the conversation moved into field work term and summer experiences. Having just told them that I was from Sierra Leone, and that I spent my first and second field work terms in South Africa and Ghana respectively, and explaining to them what I was doing when I was there, the mom turned to me with an inquisitive yet very familiar question. How were you able to go there? And why did you even decide to go back? I couldn't help but pause for a while as if I was trying to wrap my head around these questions. But the mom continued. I mean, there is war going on over there, right? How can you do such kind of research in that environment? I nodded as if Africa is one hell of a place that I should feel lucky to have escaped from. But in truth, I was deeply enraged. I was enraged to hear about the beautiful place I call home, covered with a blanket of negativity and despair, and the entire continent of Africa reduced to helpless contortions of reality. But having lived here for 2 years now, I've come to learn more about Africa and to view Africa quite differently. Africa is both an abyss of affliction for its people and a utopian paradise. It is a place where donors and goodwill ambassadors can go to serve their time in purgatory and come back with tales of how they saved ignorant, wretched tribesmen of the black horrors of the dark continent. You see, the story of the mom is not just a one-time occurrence. It is something I live through almost every day. But what stunned me most was how familiar her questions were. They reminded me of the countless questions I encountered here during my first term, sometimes even from friends. For instance, during my first science workshop, I remember a guy walked up to me with remarkable confidence and asked, "How did you get here?" A typical question to which my friend Usainu amusingly replies, "I walked through the forest for 2 months until I got there." Indeed, Africans don't even know that planes exist, let alone seeing one. I almost told the guy about the flying African elephant which I used to contemplate. During my first week here, I repeatedly encountered thought-provoking statements like, "Oh, you're from Africa, right? That's so cool." Yeah. I will still wonder what's so cool about just coming from Africa. You know, questions like these make me feel pity for the hardships I must have endured in the country of Africa, while at the same time being admired for overcoming them. For many sleepless nights, I reveled in the mix of pity and pride that are present in those statements. Sometimes I even wonder if I was indeed living in Africa. I wonder how I survived the ravaging lions, the menacing African dogs, you know, and the scorching savannah sun without sunscreen. Another very normal question I've encountered here is, what is Africa like? I have to say this is the hardest question I've come across, and I include all the physics and chemistry factors. What is Africa like? Wait a second. Are you asking me about the weather? As that seems to be the most appropriate conversation starter. Or do you mean how are the wars and the jungles like? Or are you just asking me how are the people like in Africa? I can't help but think the person is asking whether my family lives in huts, or perhaps more accurately, in trees. And how many monkeys my family hunts for dinner every day. The underlying problem is the tendency for people like the Chernoh or my friend from Science Workshop to see Africa solely as the sum of its problems. Africa, if that even exists, is seen in very paternalistic terms as being solely in need of being saved. Just think about the Save the Children or World Vision video clips. The countless For Africa charity signs we see everywhere. And the images which makes the average person in this room reach out for their wallet or a box of tissues when they hear the word Africa. The questions from the Chernoh and my friend from Science Workshop are based on a firm pre-knowledge of the inferiority and savagery of the peoples of Africa, who are struggling day by day to survive the harshness and dangers of their environment. It is a knowledge consumed from fitful, overly brief, and amazingly consistent images of starving families, dying AIDS victims, marauding rebels and child soldiers, helpless refugees and refugee camps, you name them. This is the Africa that they've come to know. But it definitely is not the Africa that I grew up in and I know. Questions like, how did you get here, are not just products from these images we see in the media. They are not just born from ignorance and misinformation. They embody class, racial, or even continental prejudice. And even though they might be quite funny, they are also extremely offensive. They embed certain elements of inferiority and backwardness. I'm not pointing fingers, nor am I complaining. I'm just highlighting some of the very essential identities that are lost within the African discourse. The construction of Africa as a mere object of salvation is not just problematic, it is dehumanizing. I hope you do not misunderstand me. I'm not saying that Africa does not have problems. Africa has enormous problems and challenges, but these are not the only things that purport the complete image of Africa. Questions like the ones that you just heard are proceedings from the collective historical and contemporary hate prejudice notion of Africa that have persisted society for far too long. And this undoubtedly affects the way we regard or disregard Africa and Africans. As I've already said, I've learned so many things about Africa here, perhaps even more so than I did when I was back in Africa. I've learned about the real Africa, the Africa that only exists in America. In fact, I only learned that I was African when I arrived at Bennington College. And I'm grateful for all of that. But I disagree that I represent Africa here. Besides the fact that this notion is wrong, it comes with a responsibility too big for this young soul of mine to carry. And I'm not ready for that. Thankfully, there is no Africa for me to represent. Africa does not exist. I insist on identifying myself as originating from a specific country like Sierra Leone or Botswana or Ghana rather than a generic Africa. But perhaps more surprisingly, what I learned is that Africans are at least suspect or unexpected in their immediate proximity, especially if that happens to be Bennington, southern Vermont. To my good friend from Science Workshop, it is practically impossible to see an African here. I find this rather amusing. I was born in a small town in the eastern part of Sierra Leone, which I often have to explain is a tiny country in West Africa. I grew up in an average family and led a normal life until age 7, when the civil war broke out and caused my family to flee. Sierra Leone was ravaged by a brutal civil war in the 90s, whose blood has left an indelible stain, not just on who I am, but also on what I can become. But until that day, I never for a day went to bed hungry, and never for a second felt my mind shackled by thoughts of poverty. But even before I was born, I was known to my friend from Science Workshop. I could be placed in the context of a continent and peoples that have been described repeatedly in popular discourse. This is not just the absence of mere respect, but the presence of outright holistic denigration of Africa and Africans. As Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian writer and famous novelist, once said, the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, it is that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Indeed, the mythical, exotic Africa is a story often told to grace the ears of the listeners and glorify the storytellers. But this story is also an injustice to all of us. The African continent has a vast abundance in knowledge, talents, and so many diverse cultures and languages. But these are all often eclipsed by the one-sided story of poor Africa. This perception causes the mom in my new friend from Science Workshop and countless others to miss so much, and we as an institution, we are missing so much. I'm quite disappointed that there are no African studies or Latino studies or other more deep-rooted cultural studies at this institution. We simply cannot excuse ourselves for this. But in the meantime, I will challenge all of us to do more to try and reimagine Africa. I will conclude with words from my grandfather, Chinua Achebe. I have news for you. Africa is not fiction. Africa is people. Have you thought of that? You may even have the best of intentions, but have you really thought of Africa as people? Have you?